Good morning on Rossiya. Drones attacked a chemical plant.
It's really smoking over there, like seriously. In
Occupied Donetsk, there's another blackout. Putin threatens to seize Donbas and other Ukrainian territories by any means necessary.
Either we will liberate these territories by military means, or Ukrainian forces will leave these territories and stop fighting there.
The Ukrainian armed forces continue to hold the northern part of Pokrovsk. Resources are stretched to the limit. Rubio assessed the capabilities of the Russian army.
If you look at the map from March-April after the invasion and compare it to the map now, the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians far back.
The West is strengthening Ukraine. There will be even more weapons.
Norway is providing $500 million, and Germany is giving $200 million and another $25 million. NATO fund.
The bitter truth, a Russian general admitted the Kremlin's fatal mistake in Ukraine.
As is often the case, the enemy was significantly underestimated, and their own forces were greatly overestimated.
Urgent news from Pokrovsk. The commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrsky, does not confirm the capture of the Ukrainian city by the Russians. At this time, already, basically half dead. Kadyrov is threatening Europe with war, saying that soon Europeans will have to apologize to the Russian Federation. Meanwhile, for the third time since the beginning of the year, Ukraine has struck one of Russia's largest chemical manufacturers for its military-industrial complex. The enemy struck the Kherson thermal power plant and it has stopped functioning. And once again about Kadyrov's men. On the front, they got beaten again. Ramzan Kadyrov shouldn't be thinking about war in Europe, but about the health of his subordinates. We've gathered all the most important military news in this segment. Afterwards, I'll be waiting in the studio for discussions.
Don't say hop until you've jumped over. A Ukrainian proverb perfectly describes the current situation for the Russian armed forces in the Lyman direction. Here, the occupiers managed to advance a little, which they immediately reported. Z military correspondents. But obviously their reports are also read by Ukrainian intelligence, thanks to which the Ukrainian armed forces received timely information, which they immediately
Took full and complete advantage of the prevailing circumstances and opportunities presented. At the very same moment in time, concurrently and simultaneously, a parallel set of events unfolded, creating a complex and interconnected situation that demanded immediate attention and careful consideration from all parties involved.
the heaviest fighting on the front traditionally takes place in the Pokrovsk area. A high-ranking NATO official stated that the Russians control 95% of the city. In Ukraine, however, they explained that in the West, grey zones are often attributed to the occupiers, without fully understanding the specifics of the fighting. Therefore, in reality, the situation is better, although still very
difficult and incredibly challenging for our forces. Their overarching strategic goal is to completely and utterly disrupt our entire logistical network, including all supply lines and support systems vital for the Mirnograd garrison, primarily because Pokrovsk and Mirnograd are not merely adjacent, but in fact form a single, interconnected, and strategically crucial urban agglomeration, making their combined infrastructure a prime target for enemy operations. In any case, even today, despite all the efforts of the Russians, the defensive operation in Pokrovsk continues.
At the same time, for several weeks now, Putin has been blindly repeating that Pokrovsk is completely under Russian control. According to Sky News, Russia deliberately announced the capture of Pokrovsk ahead of negotiations with the US, which took place on December 2nd. However, in reality, things are quite different. Moreover, the Vostok troop grouping reported that the defense forces are organizing additional logistical routes to supply their units in Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, where intense fighting continues. And in the city itself, the Ukrainian armed forces continue to eliminate Russian occupiers in the urban area.
In the 7th Rapid Response Corps of the Ukrainian Air Assault Forces, they told Reuters that they are holding the northern part of Pokrovsk and conducting assault operations in the southern part, where Russian troops predominate.
Another settlement that remains on the front pages is Kupiansk. Despite daily attempts by the Russians to turn the situation around here, they have not succeeded. The initiative remains with the Ukrainian armed forces, and the clearing of enemy units is already taking place on the outskirts of the city.
At the moment, about 50 to 60% of the city is completely under the control of the defense forces, with another 20% being a gray zone. As always, the Special Operations Forces units performed excellently. They played an important role at the most critical moment.
Moreover, Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky stated that the Ukrainian armed forces are not only destroying the enemy, but also cutting off the occupiers' logistical routes, including those the enemy uses to send in reserve forces.
There are no successes. The clearing operation is underway. And now, in fact, those very routes through which the enemy had established infiltration into Kupiansk have been blocked. This is actually what corresponds to reality, because if it were otherwise, we would have seen changes to the map in Kupiansk, but there are no changes there.
Recently, alarming news has been coming from the Zaporizhzhia region. Our command acknowledges that the enemy has had some success there. However, the General Staff is making every effort to stabilize the situation. And according to analysts, the pace of the enemy's advance has already been significantly reduced.
Humiliated, which the enemy was counting on entering, right here and now continues to hold. Some Russian units that previously tried to infiltrate this settlement were destroyed. And in principle, in the near future, I think we will see that very stabilization of the front in this sector.
In total, over the past day, the enemy attempted more than 200 times to storm the positions of the Ukrainian armed forces. In these attacks, more than 1,200 occupiers were eliminated, as well as nearly 50 vehicles and more than a dozen artillery systems destroyed.
Military analyst Denis Popovich is joining our broadcast. Denis, hello, we're glad to see you.
Good afternoon, likewise.
So let's talk about Pokrovsk. Yesterday, Bild reported that it has been completely captured by the Russians. Of course, Putin keeps saying that Pokrovsk is under full control, but our Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrsky, reports that our defense forces are still present in the northern part of the city. And they are preventing a build-up there of a large number of Russian assault groups. The goal is to hold back their possible advance further, bypassing Pokrovsk and Myrnorad. Could you please tell us what is actually happening in this direction?
Bild exaggerated quite a bit by stating that Pokrovsk has been completely abandoned by Ukrainian troops. Ukrainian forces are in the northern part of the city, holding positions at the railway, along the railway line, which divides the city into two parts, two unequal parts. The northern part is a bit smaller, the southern part is a bit larger. And right now the fighting is taking place in the northern part of the city, which is exactly why the deep state map marks this area as a gray zone. Because wherever there is fighting, that area is in fact marked as a gray zone. Therefore, it's far too early to say that Pokrovsk has been abandoned. The intense fighting continues, but for now, its ultimate outcome is by no means predetermined in this particular case.
I understand. All right, but still, could you please assess Putin's enthusiasm when he says that Russian troops could move further, as he calls it, toward Novorossiya, meaning not just Donbas anymore? He's not talking about Donbas, but about other territories of Ukraine that the Russians have declared as their own. What are the prospects that they will advance in new directions as well? Or for now, is everything focused on Pokrovsk and it's too early to plan anything else?
Well, what does Novorossiya mean in Putin's understanding? Donetsk, Luhansk, Kharkiv, Zaporizhzhia, Dnipropetrovsk regions.
Kherson.
Kherson, all of Zaporizhzhia, Odessa, Mykolaiv regions. Yes, that is the main republics like Crimea. This is his understanding. Novorossiya, he stated this in 2014. For those who have the desire and opportunity, you can listen to his speech, I think, on April 17th, 2014, where he decided what Novorossiya is. I want to remind you that even according to his so-called constitution, which he fully incorporated, Kherson region and Zaporizhzhia region, even with the regional centers that he does not currently control. Mykolaiv region, Odessa region, Dnipropetrovsk region do not appear. That is why we are now seeing his further threats, which are connected to the idea that if you don't give me what I want now, I will go further. I will keep seizing more territory. Right now, he does not have the ability to seize Mykolaiv or Odessa regions. He is present in the Dnipropetrovsk region, present in the Crimean region, but there we have heard that we have had successes in liberating settlements, not far from the border of Donetsk region. So these are just scare tactics. Yes, that is an attempt at informational pressure amid negotiations and amid Ukraine's disagreement, as well as the disagreement of Ukraine's European allies. To accept those, let's say, proposals, yes, we can put it in quotes, or those demands, those ultimatum demands that Putin is making regarding the terms for a ceasefire.
All right, let's discuss something else now. Dobropilya. There, the Russians are saying that occupation has taken place as well. Our armed forces are currently denying this information according to the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. They say that enemy sabotage and reconnaissance groups have been eliminated, and the settlement is still under the control of our defense forces for now. Please comment on the situation in the Dobropilya area and what, let's say, dangerous scenarios exist there for us.
Which Dobropilya? In Donetsk region?
Of course.
Well, the capture of Dobropilya exists only in a sick mind. Putin's. They weren't even there when the enemy approached this settlement. At the peak of their offensive in August, there were no enemy forces in Dobropilya, and now all the more so they're not there because the Dobropilya salient, these narrow protrusions, have been cut off. Perhaps you mean Dobropilya in Zaporizhzhia region, and that's what was being discussed.
Let me check now. It seems so, Dennis. I apologize for the slip of the tongue.
Dobropilya, Zaporizhzhia region, yes, there was information about that, and there was a statement from the standard headquarters refuting it, saying that sabotage groups trying to infiltrate there had been eliminated. Well, for now, we can put a period on this. The only thing is, when we talk about all the ground points located north of Humiliated, and Dobropilya is roughly at the 11 o'clock position from Humiliated, we're talking about an attempt to cut off logistics in the Humiliated area. Right now, the enemy is trying. The situation there is very alarming. He was advancing on Humiliated, but now our fighters, our units, have stopped the Russians on the approach to this settlement. Therefore, it's clear that the enemy is now making efforts to bypass Humiliated from the north as much as possible and block logistics heading toward this city.
Thank you. Let's talk about our successes, including some interesting news from the Stavropol region. There, a chemical plant came under attack. It's called Nevinomisk Azot, and by the way, other important facilities as well. Let me share a few details. There were powerful explosions there. Local sources report that the strike targeted this chemical plant specifically. It is one of the largest producers of nitrogen fertilizers and ammonia in Russia. Eyewitnesses spoke about air defense activity, loud noises, flashes, the sky, and so on. And among other things, after this incident, Rosaviatsia suspended the operation of airports in Kaluga, Volgograd, and Tambov for security reasons. Please assess this strike on the plant, which, as I understand it, produces serious chemical products. It seems we haven't hit such facilities in quite a while.
I think one way or another, it's a chemical enterprise. It could be involved in the production of explosives, gunpowder, everything needed for munitions manufacturing. That's why enterprises of this kind serve a dual purpose. They produce both nitrogen fertilizers and also work on projects related to the needs of the Russian Federation. Therefore, any enterprise with a dual purpose in this case becomes a military target. And this can be regarded as a strike on an enterprise that is part of the Russian Federation's military-industrial complex.
All right, Dennis, let's discuss Putin's threats about war with Europe. Just recently, Putin said that if Europe wants to go to war with Russia, then Russia is ready right now. And he threatened that this could lead to a situation where there will be no one left to negotiate with there, essentially implying a nuclear strike on the European continent. Naturally, he picked up the tune of his boss. Kadyrov also recently said that, among other things, Europe will soon be apologizing to Russia in the event of war. Well, obviously, what else is he supposed to say? He needs to make himself known in the information space somehow. Could you please tell us, how realistic is it right now that Russia is ready for war with Europe? Are they seriously considering such scenarios if we're not talking about this drone terror that we've already seen more than once?
I have repeatedly said, and I want to say it again, the Russian Federation will go to war with Europe sooner or later. I have written about this many times, and now I want to say it once again. The only thing is, the nature of this war may depend on whether the active phase of fighting in Ukraine comes to an end. If it does end, yes, in the foreseeable future, then troops will be freed up and the countdown for Europe will move faster. Why do I believe that Putin will go to war with Europe? Because his economy right now is running on a war footing. In general, it's simply not profitable to end the war because everything is tied to the war. And if the war with Ukraine ends, or if the hot phase of fighting stops, that pressure will need to be released somewhere. The main candidate for this, unfortunately, is the Baltic countries, which are NATO members. But in Putin's view, NATO is incapable of mounting a unified response, and in the event of a strike on the Baltic states, he is counting on the reaction being delayed. And this would undermine the alliance's very institutional ability to fulfill its collective defense obligations. That's why he has such a plan. In fact, we can see the inconsistency in his statements. Now, you just mentioned the threats, and you also brought up Kadyrov. Before that, or rather at the very same time, there were threats coming from Dmitry Medvedev as well. He said something terrible would happen if you take away our assets that are currently frozen in the Belgian bank Euroclear, which is located in Belgium. And literally just a couple of weeks before that, Putin was swearing up and down, saying, I'm ready to sign any document to confirm that I won't attack Europe. But there were exactly the same statements before saying, we won't attack Ukraine, right before they invaded our country. That's why Europeans need to get very serious and probably consolidate their efforts, find some kind of leader who could, in general, take the lead. This movement related to preparing for war. And in my opinion, war is at Europe's doorstep. It's approaching.
Well, actually, it's interesting to note here that after Kadyrov's threats, or during these threats, one of the Akhmat units was almost completely destroyed. One of the Akhmat subdivisions, to be precise. So what happened on November 29th in the temporarily occupied territory of Berdyansk in the Zaporizhzhia region? The GUR carried out an operation, and in fact, during the movement, together with the resistance movement, Russian occupiers from the so-called Akhmat unit suffered losses as a result of several explosions. It's noteworthy, of course, whether the Kadyrovites are actually showing up on the front lines now, or if they're just hiding out in the rear, let's say, in the temporarily occupied territories. Have you noticed any active participation from them in battles recently?
I haven't heard anything. There hasn't been any news about them lately. There are certain units that have taken part in the fighting, but primarily they were heard about in the Kursk region. But for the most part, they serve as blocking detachments. That is, they essentially make sure that regular Russian units made up of contract soldiers don't retreat or run away. That's precisely why the Kadyrovites aren't very popular on the front among Russian servicemen. You mentioned Berdyansk. I can also recall strikes directly on the territory of Chechnya. That is, there were strikes on Rosgvardia units there. Kadyrovites are, as a rule, part of the Rosgvardia, always Rosgvardia. And in general, they carry out their functions as blocking detachments all the time. Now they have started to get hit even on their own territory. There were a couple of incidents just last week, and this week as well, by the way.
Thank you. In conclusion, I'd like to add, because I think it's important for viewers to understand, that Germany is deploying fighter jets to Poland to protect NATO's eastern flank. In other words, there is a clear response to Putin's statement. This also involves about 150 military personnel, mostly pilots and technical specialists who work with aviation. Thank you very much. Denis Popovich, military commentator, was on air with Ukraine Today. All the best. Goodbye.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.